Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all here. Thanks for being with us, and I hope you had a nice Thanksgiving. I am Janice Kaminer Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads virtual town hall program. Our judge leadership team includes former Congressman Mel Levine, David Lehrer, former LA County Supervisor, who's with me tonight, Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. And you saw our list of co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago. We are so pleased tonight to present one of our favorite guests, Max Boot, in conversation with the always amazing Pat Morrison on the topic that is floating around in all of our hearts, minds, and souls: could Trump win a second term? For 85 consecutive weeks, we have presented these weekly virtual town halls as a way to fulfill our mission of providing programs which inspire you to inspire us as well, to stay informed, engaged, strong, and motivated, and committed to protecting the foundations of our democratic institutions. Tonight, many of us have lit or will soon lit the fourth Hanukkah candle. If we need reminding of the importance of fighting against authoritarianism, Hanukkah is the perfect time to be reminded. One of the miracles of Hanukkah is that in the year 175 BCE, an outnumbered minority, the Maccabees, against all odds, resisted the anti-Semitic and terrifying reign of Antiochus IV. By persevering in their resistance and by their willingness to fight for their beliefs, the Maccabees prevailed. This is a story which is almost as old as time, and it's a message which is universal in nature. We do not have the luxury of abandoning our fight for this democracy, which, even with all of its flaws, has been a light unto the nation since its founding. The perpetuation of our American democracy is worth the fight, just as the preservation of Judaism was worth the battle at the center of the Hanukkah story. So happy Hanukkah to everybody, and thank you for being here with us tonight. We've got some amazing programs coming up. Next week, Jared Diamond, who's just a very interesting man, a specialist in about 15 different fields of science, as well as anthropology and even sociology, will be talking to us about personal and global and national crisis with Pat Morrison. The week after that, we have Governor Whitmer, who's going to be talking about navigating extreme partisanship. You all know that she was the target of a kidnapping attempt during this past year. Then we're having a program on youth voting trends amongst millennials and Gen Z, and voter suppression relating to America's youngest voters. We have a fantastic panel who'll be discussing that. We're going to start 2022 with a special program dedicated to the January 6th insurrection. Carol Lanning from the Washington Post will be joined by Joanna Mendelson from the ADL and Imran Ahmed from the Center for Countering Digital Hate. And we're going to be seeing what the current state of affairs is in terms of violence and white nationalism. Later in January, we've got some other fantastic programs scheduled, one with Ann Applebaum from The Atlantic, and a special program after that with college presidents about events transpiring on America's college campuses. So as we prepare to close out another year in what was supposed to be a 4 or 5 week digital virtual series of programs, we want to thank you, our audience. Whether you are Jewish or not, your loyalty and persistence embodies the Hanukkah spirit, and we really appreciate it. We also appreciate your donations, which keep our programs going. So thank you for that as well. And we always have the donation link up on during our program and in our emails. There's full unedited recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel and on our websites. We always send a link in every email. Now to introduce our speakers tonight, my terrific colleague, longtime friend, and fabulous and legendary civic leader, Zev Yaroslavsky. Zev, take it away.
Thank you very much, Janice. I guess if you live long enough, you become a legend. Thank you, and good evening to our thousands of viewers tonight from across the country and around the world, and a happy Hanukkah to those who celebrate Hanukkah, and a happy holiday season to everyone else, and a happy and peaceful and healthy new year coming up in about a month. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers this evening. Let me make sure I have my text here. I'm not a pro. Our guest speaker this evening, Max Boot. Max is no stranger to our audiences, having been a guest on a number of occasions. He was born in Moscow, Russia, emigrated at a young age to the United States in 1976, and moved to Los Angeles, where he was raised. Max attended UC Berkeley, where he graduated with honors in 1991, received his MA in diplomatic history from Yale University 1 year later, and began his career in journalism, writing for the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and many others. He is now the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has authored a number of books, including The Road Not Taken, a biography of Edward Lansdale, and his most recent book, The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right, which is received wide acclaim. He is one of the most important political commentators in our nation, and we are honored to have him back here with us this evening. And to engage him in conversation is one of our regular moderators, the incomparable Los Angeles Times columnist and herself a successful author, Pat Morrison. Pat is well known in the Southern California area to viewers, listeners, and readers. Her stellar career chronicling Los Angeles life and many other things, and her stints as a commentator and host on public radio and television, which have earned her Golden Mike Awards as well as Emmy Awards, as well as being a part of a team that received the Pulitzer Prize at the Los Angeles Times, have made her a household figure here and beyond. I consider her a dear friend. And so, Pat, I turn it over to you and to Max.
Thank you, Zev, my friend, and thank you, Janice, as well. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening on what is an important, if perhaps unsettling, conversation about the road that lies ahead of us, or maybe the several roads and which one we will choose to travel as a nation. Max, thanks to you for coming back. Always good to talk to you.
Great to be here, and congratulations to Zev and Janice and Mel and David and everybody else who has made this series such a tremendous success. I'm so glad to see it going. It's one of my favorite places to appear, in part because I always get to talk to such smart and interesting people like Pat.
Well, thank you, Max. And we're going to be talking about Trump, but the presidential election is about 3 years out. However, the anniversary of the January 6th attack on the Capitol is just a little over a month out. And the news out of Capitol Hill today was that the Congressional Committee voted to hold Jeffrey Clark in criminal contempt for not speaking to Congress, for not cooperating with a subpoena, for invoking executive privilege about the events of that day. Now we hear that he's volunteered to come to Capitol Hill, but he will invoke the Fifth Amendment, which is a different matter altogether. We also have heard just within the last couple of days that Mark Meadows, the former Trump chief of staff, has decided to cooperate, to offer a deposition to the committee, and in parallel has published a book with some interesting revelations. So what does this say to you about the events of January 6th and how what happened that day, our perception of it will change, and maybe how we choose to treat it will change, given what we may be hearing in the near future from people who were so closely involved in the event?
Well, Pat, I think the more we learn about what happened on January 6th and what almost happened, the more horrifying it becomes. I mean, this is really an event without precedent in American history. You've never had a situation where a president refused to accept the election outcome and then mobilized a mob to storm the Capitol to prevent the certification of the election. And we've certainly learned more about the fact that this was far from a spontaneous uprising. We've learned about the Eastman memo, which was put together by one of Trump's lawyers, which was basically a blueprint for a coup d'etat, a way that Mike Pence could, in theory, prevent the vote certification, and through these complicated maneuvers that may or may not have worked, somehow throw the election of the House where Trump could have won. Certainly you had people like Jeffrey Clark who were involved, and he was an assistant attorney general at the time. He was trying to use the powers of the Department of Justice to pressure the state of Georgia into overturning the election results and appointing a slate of electors pledged to Trump rather than to Biden. Now, we don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but suffice it to say, this was an unprecedented attack on American democracy. And what is shocking to me now, almost a year later, is the extent to which the Republican Party basically doesn't give a damn. I mean, you have the January 6th committee operating, but only with 2 renegade Republicans on it, both of whom have basically been excommunicated from the Republican Party, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, the mainstream GOP continues very tightly aligned with Donald Trump. I mean, I thought, there was a moment of recoil and horror immediately after January 6th, where you had, pretty harsh words against Trump, even from the likes of Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and Lindsey Graham and many others. But then about 30 seconds later, it seemed like they said, "Oh, never mind. Let's move on. Let's this is unimportant. The fact that there was this, attempted attack on our democracy. Who cares?" Like saying, like 2 days after 9/11, let's move on. It doesn't really matter that this bad thing happened. Let's move on to something else. And that's basically the stance of the Republican Party. And right now, you have about 60% of Republicans who are saying that they want Donald Trump to run again after having been impeached twice, after having attacked our democracy, after having done everything to undermine this country that he could possibly do. 60% of Republicans still want him to run again. I mean, that's a pretty horrifying commentary on the state of our country.
Well, as the January 6th anniversary approaches, and we see this split, we see people who are part of the Trump administration beginning to crumble, maybe to turn on Donald Trump, to testify to things that he doesn't want known, doesn't want heard. At the same time, January 6th may very well become a dangerous rallying point for people who believe exactly what you outlined, that this was no big deal. In fact, that it may have been a triumph for them to try to overturn the election results. This is a fearful thing, but a divided course that we look at.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think we would all like to think that January 6th was the culmination of this horrifying trend, this attack on American democracy undertaken by the Republican Party. But I think the more we learn, the more we realize, no, this was just perhaps a trial run for something even worse in the future. I mean, right now, all over the country, Trump acolytes are trying to take over election positions, secretaries of state in various states and county election boards and others that certify election results. And you have a huge number of Republican congressional candidates who echo the big lie, saying that it was actually Donald Trump who won the election. The election was stolen from him. And this has become kind of a litmus test of belonging to the Republican Party. It's very hard to challenge that myth in a Republican primary and survive. And so, you have to put that together with the fact that Republicans are heavily favored to win the midterm elections less than a year from now. The party that doesn't control the White House almost always wins the midterms, and the polling for President Biden right now is pretty bad. So, if the midterms were held tomorrow, it would be a landslide for the Republican Party. And then you would have Republicans probably in control of both houses of Congress and quite a few state legislatures, local election boards, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think the ultimate nightmare scenario we have to contemplate is what happens under those circumstances in 2024 if Trump runs again, and let's say kind of a similar outcome where Biden also runs again. He gets a huge majority of the popular vote, but the electoral vote is very close as it was last time. Mm-hmm. At that point, can we have any confidence that Republican state officials in the Republican Congress would actually certify a Democratic victory? I don't have any confidence that would happen.
The Republicans have been working on this sort of unified field theory of the operations of democracy from the bottom up for a long time. So there's redistricting, gerrymandering, isolating even majority minority groups and districts. There's restricting voting rights because they know they'll probably have the backing of the courts, as we saw earlier with the gutting of the original Voting Rights Act, disempowering state election officials and putting that power in the hands of partisan legislatures. They seem to be outflanking the Democrats at every turn. So even though millions of votes, whether it's 6 million more for Hillary Clinton or X million more, 7 million more for Joe Biden may speak, they will not have the leverage to have their will done. This is an impasse that we've talked about before, but I don't think we've ever seen it happen on this scale.
It's frightening. And the one mechanism that Democrats have to strike back and to ensure that the votes are actually counted is by passing voting rights legislation in Congress, which they can't do right now because Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, among others, are devoted to the filibuster. So you have to have 60 votes in the Senate. They clearly don't have 60 votes. And so Democrats are sort of fighting with one hand tied behind their back, while Republicans are doing everything possible to tilt the 2022 and 2024 elections their way by means fair or foul. I mean, this is something that we should be very alarmed about, I think.
What's going on in Congress and especially the Senate? You mentioned Sinema and Manchin, who seem to be the powers really in the Senate, and the Dr. No and Senator No. You've got Ted Cruz, who's holding up Senate or nominations to ambassadorships, maybe just because he can do so. Among them, the nomination for LA's Mayor Eric Garcetti to be ambassador to India. So the whole Senate is constructed as a minoritarian authority, whether it's a filibuster or blocking nominations or this sort of thing. But people are very puzzled by Sinema and Manchin, and Democrats are angered by Ted Cruz, perhaps, but expect nothing different. So for Sinema and Manchin to hold the Biden agenda hostage, what are they putting at risk besides the immediate aspects of that? What are they doing to the Democratic Party?
Well, I mean, I think the big risk they're running is, again, by blocking the voting rights legislation to ensure that everybody can make their vote heard and felt, to possibly roll back some of the extreme redistricting that Republicans are practicing at the state level, and to make it harder for Republican state legislatures to simply appoint electors on their own, regardless of how their states vote. I mean, I think these are crucial safeguards to our democracy, which are being held back because Manchin and Sinema, I think, have this irrational devotion to the filibuster. And I mean, I can sort of understand it, because I used to think that the filibuster was also, a key part of our democracy. But in fact, that's really not the case. The House has never really had a filibuster. And even in the Senate, it's been largely used to stop the passage of civil rights legislation. It has never been used as much as it's been used in the last few decades, when Mitch McConnell in particular has become a master of the filibuster, and they don't even have to talk anymore. They just say filibuster, and then that's it. And you need 60 votes. Or, they have also these archaic rules of senatorial privilege that Ted Cruz is, as you mentioned, is now using to hold up the appointment of ambassadors and other national security officials in a way that is really paralyzing our government. And it's just a shameful display of partisanship and misuse of Senate procedure. I think that, just one key statistic to keep in mind, Pat, is, the 50 Republican members of the US Senate represent about 40 million fewer voters than the 50 Democrats. So this is an extreme example of the tyranny of the minority here.
And also with the Senate, if you look at this as a prolongation of the Trump policy of essentially disassembling the national security apparatus, disassembling the State Department, why is it in their interest to do this? Or is it just the fact that they can?
I think it's just the fact they can. I mean, there's some irony in the fact that Ted Cruz's ostensible justification for his current blockade on nominees is that he feels the Biden administration is not tough enough on Russia. For example, they allowed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany to go forward. I mean, this is Ted Cruz, who was backing Donald Trump while Donald Trump was using US military aid to blackmail the president of Ukraine into helping him politically, and who was, saying that he found Putin to be very strong and very credible and very powerful, and just slobbering all over Putin. And now Cruz is accusing, Joe Biden of being insufficiently tough on Putin. It doesn't make any sense. This is just, I hesitate to even mention his absurd justifications. This is basically just muscle flexing and saying, we can use our power to screw up a Democratic administration regardless of the national interest.
Consistency, thou art a jewel. So, but speaking of consistency, you've written about this, which the idea that the opposition to vaccine mandates has been local, has been state, has been regional, has been found on Capitol Hill as well. You have in Montana, a friend of mine said that now even hospitals are not allowed to ask about vaccination status, which sort of defies credulity. And at the same time, as you point out, the Republicans who are against vaccine mandates are saying, aha, look, Joe Biden, the infection numbers are going up. He's failing us as a president.
Yeah, this is another example of just pure partisanship and just disingenuous argumentation where, as I put in a column this week, Republicans are hampering Joe Biden from fighting the pandemic, and then they're attacking him for not being more successful in fighting the pandemic. I mean, he would have a heck of a lot more success if Fox News were not broadcasting anti-vaccine propaganda on a nightly basis. And oh, by the way, for a Fox News employee to actually enter the Fox building, they have to have either proof of a vaccination or a daily negative COVID test, which is a very strict standard. And so they enforce, COVID vaccine requirements for their own staff. But for the rubes out there who believe what they hear on Fox News, they're being told that, oh, natural immunity is much better. You shouldn't get vaccinated. It's an invasion of our liberty, all this other nonsense. And of course, you have governors, like Greg Abbott in Texas and Ron DeSantis in Florida, who are basically in a race to see how much they can screw up the fight against COVID in the name of, this medical liberty, where they're doing even the most crazy un-Republican things like prohibiting businesses from asking for proof of vaccination from somebody entering, or now a bunch of these states are actually offering unemployment benefits to people who get fired because they refuse to get vaccinated. I mean, this is something that if Democrats were doing this, Republicans would be calling it socialism, but Republicans, it's just so crazy. It's so irrational. It doesn't make any sense. We should all be united in fighting this virus, and yet we can't even get together in fighting this threat, which has killed nearly 800,000 Americans.
You characterize it as geniusocracy versus idiocracy.
Yeah, and the idiocracy is winning. I mean, when I talk about geniusocracy, that I'm talking about, the creative segment of our country, like including the scientists and doctors who came up with these vaccines in record time. Truly a miracle, an international effort that has offered us a way out of this horrible pandemic. But we have this idiocracy where, you have only 60% of Republicans are vaccinated compared to 90% of Democrats. And so you have more than 100 million Americans who refuse to get fully vaccinated, even though the vaccines are out there. And so we've had this literally unbelievable situation where more Americans have died of COVID-19 this year than last year, even though this year we've had vaccines that will save you, that will, in 95% of cases, prevent you from dying or even more. And people refuse to take those vaccines for a variety of crazy, misguided reasons.
At the same time, we're seeing this medical liberty argument play out. The not with my body, you don't. We see the Supreme Court considering Mississippi and other challenges to Roe versus Wade about bodily autonomy, which women have argued for years. And I was listening to the oral arguments, but what plays out in the larger context now, as everything does these days, is what the court does, how it affects the politics, how it affects the perception of the court, or will the Republicans who have been working to overturn Roe for almost 50 years be willing to own this politically? And what about the effect of the court if they do, in fact, effectively overturn Roe?
Well, again, this is another example of minority tyranny on the Supreme Court, because again, you have 6 justices of the Supreme Court who have been appointed by Republican presidents. And in the last, since 1992, Republicans have only won the popular vote for the presidency once, I believe. Since 1988, in fact, they've only won the popular vote once in 2004. And yet Republicans have been able to appoint 6 justices on the Supreme Court. And this is really kind of the justification and payoff for the entire Trump presidency from the standpoint of a lot of people on the religious right. This is why so many evangelicals back Trump, because he would appoint Supreme Court justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade. And I think you're seeing that happen right now. But it's a horrifying situation, which I think is going to mean that, in something like 20 states, they're going to outlaw abortion in the way that Texas has already basically done just that. So, this is just kind of shows you the high stakes involved, and I think really shows some of the deep flaws in our constitutional system that a minority can impose its will on the entire country in this manner.
But we've seen Republicans in Congress do brinkmanship. They will vote against something that they know is going to pass, like the Biden Build Back Better infrastructure thing, knowing they will be the beneficiaries. So they get to claim, look, I voted against it, but at the same time, they're going to be there when they cut the ribbon to open the new bridge or the new hospital.
Right.
So what about now Roe? If they've been saying we need to overturn Roe, are there going to be political consequences for Republicans if there is no more, effectively, no more Roe versus Wade?
I mean, I think it's very hard to know for sure how it's going to play out. I mean, clearly, there's going to be a lot of people in places like California and Illinois and New York who are going to be up in arms, but those are states that are voting Democratic anyway. Are there going to be people up in arms in Louisiana or Mississippi? I'm not so sure about that. I think, that's Republicans mainly care about the primary electorate because, that's they mainly run in safe districts and safe states. So most of them are not competing for swing votes or Democratic votes. So it's quite possible that they could actually get away with this. I think there's a lot of hope that there will be a huge backlash, but I'm not sure if that's in fact the case.
Let's then get to the main event, which is Donald Trump and the question about his influence in the Republican Party, his influence as it remains in the country, whether he will run. But is there such a thing as Trumpism that becomes unmoored from Donald Trump? Because we saw at one event, at least, he suggested to the crowd that everybody get vaccinated, and he was booed, which was a remarkable thing to see. And yet he's managed to keep everybody pretty much in line, certainly on Capitol Hill, and his fan base is very loyal, if not as big as it used to be. So assess first his influence in the party and what happens to people who step out of line, even though he's no longer president and hasn't that blue pulpit.
I mean, I think Trump completely dominates the Republican Party. I mean, we had a revelation like a week ago. The RNC is actually paying for his legal representation to defend him from investigations in New York about his private business dealings. I mean, what does that have to do with the Republican Party? Nothing, except that the Republican Party has basically become a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump organization. He's got a hammerhold on the Republican Party, and anybody who speaks out against him is going to be chased out of the party in the way that Adam Kinzinger, announced he's not going to run for re-election. Liz Cheney has been drummed out of the Republican Party in her home state of Wyoming. She may not even win her primary next year. It's a very distressing situation, but despite everything that went wrong in the Trump presidency, including, of course, culminating in his attack on our democracy, he still retains pole position within the GOP. And, if he decides to run again in 2024, I doubt he will have any substantial opposition.
Do you think we're going to hear from him on January 6th? Will he make this a big deal, a tent pole of who he is and what he might become again, which is president?
Yeah, I mean, he's not shy about this. He's not sulking in a corner. He's not apologizing. He is, he's pursuing this big lie. I mean, just in the last few days, he's been demanding that people in the media debate him on election fraud, even though his specious charges of fraud were thrown out of more than 60 courtrooms. He continues to insist that he is the victim of massive, unprecedented election fraud, which of course he is not, but he keeps saying it. He's not shy about saying it. And most of his followers believe him. I mean, if you look at polls, most Republicans believe that there was in fact election fraud. I mean, this is the creepiest thing you've ever seen outside of 1984.
He's under investigation in New York, but in terms of the federal food chain about January 6th, is it really ever going to reach him? There has been some criticism of the lack of alacrity with which the Biden administration or the Justice Department seems to have been pursuing this. Maybe, an iron fist in suede gloves, but a lot of people are saying, look, they just don't want to have to deal with Trump because of exactly what might happen, an uprising that you alluded to in one of your columns.
Right. I mean, there's always a risk with prosecuting a former head of state. Of course, there's a risk that you will have, a violent uprising by his followers, which happened in South Africa when charges were brought about against Jacob Zuma, the former president of South Africa. But there is also a huge risk that I think Attorney General Merrick Garland needs to keep in mind, which is that if you don't prosecute a former president, you are basically sanctioning his misconduct and giving an invitation for even greater misconduct in the future. Now, it's certainly possible that DOJ is conducting an investigation in strict secrecy, but it's doubtful because, as we know, very little stays secret in Washington. If that investigation were going on, we would probably have some intimation of it. And certainly we know that no special counsel has been appointed to probe Donald Trump, which is something that I think should have happened already, should have happened much earlier in the Biden administration, because there are so many crimes of which he stands credibly accused, which are not being probed by state prosecutors. There's an investigation in New York of his financial dealings. There's an investigation in Atlanta over his attempt to commit election fraud in Georgia, but that's it. There's still a massive number of things, including his instigation of this insurrection against the United States, his incitement of a mob attack on the Capitol, all the counts of obstruction of justice that were uncovered in the Mueller investigation, even 2016 election fraud, for which his attorney, Michael Cohen, went to jail, and Donald Trump has never been prosecuted. So I just, I have a lot of respect for Merrick Garland. He's an excellent, moderate, centrist, former judge, widely respected, but there's no sense that he is going to risk the fallout and pushback of actually prosecuting Donald Trump. Now, I could be wrong, it could happen, but so far there's been no indication that will be the case. And, I think for a lot of years, a lot of liberals have been thinking that there is some magical legal solution that Donald Trump is going to wind up in jail and that's going to solve our problems. And I'm here to say, I just don't think it's going to happen.
Well, could the Justice Department's hand be forced by the testimony that dripping out of the House investigations?
It could. We'll see if they develop anything, incredibly incriminating, but it's very hard for the House because, as we're seeing now, they have to fight to enforce every single subpoena, and it drags on and on and on. This kind of investigation can take a long time, and the House committee is kind of under a clock. They're going to have to finish by, probably next summer at the latest, so this doesn't go into the 2022 midterm. So even if they develop some evidence, it's not going to be like, hey, take this evidence and go to a jury. The Justice Department basically has to reinvestigate everything themselves before they can bring charges.
We've seen a lot of talking heads dwelling on the Republican Party infighting, and how much of that is imaginary? How much of it is just making something big out of something maybe not so consequential, like Marjorie Taylor Greene versus Nancy Mace in Congress? You can't stand on your own 2 feet. You've got to run to the principal's office to tattletale. I mean, it's sad. Is this pinning hopes on something insubstantial?
Yeah, this is kind of Dumb and Dumber. I mean, it really tells you something about the state of the Republican Party that Nancy Mace, Congresswoman from South Carolina, who was on Fox News this weekend saying, you don't need to get vaccinated. Natural immunity is much better. Nancy Mace is like the moderate, the reasonable person in the Republican Party because she's not as crazy as Marjorie Taylor Greene and her cohorts like Lauren Boebert, who are making these offensive and insane Islamophobic insinuations against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and, calling her a terrorist, all this horrible garbage that the Republican caucus will not sanction anybody for doing this. Nancy Mace called them out, and now she's getting vilified as being a rhino and all this other stuff. I mean, this is kind of like a grade school spat, but ultimately it really doesn't affect anything because all these people, at the end of the day, they're all cult followers of Donald Trump.
Apropos of January 6th, you talk about if Trump runs and loses in 2024, January 6th becomes a symbol. And this is the Daily Mail, so I don't know how accurate it is, but the question of whether that significantly armed faction of Trump fans could become an active insurrectionary force in a country that so far has been very wary of defining domestic terrorism as terrorism.
Yeah, no, I wrote about the fact that I think we are at serious risk of a violent insurgency from the right, the greatest risk of a violent insurgency since the early 1970s, when the risk came from the left. But right now, you've already had, a lot of events, including, the the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting last year, that you had the attack on Congress. Of course, you had the horrific shootings in El Paso, then at the Tree of Life Synagogue and in Pittsburgh, the attacks in Charlottesville. There is so much that's going on that's so alarming. And the Republican Party is basically fanning the flames instead of trying to douse them, because Republicans, if you just listen to the rhetoric of ordinary Republicans, not the extreme wingnuts, but ordinary Republicans like Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, very mainstream Republicans who all think that they're potential presidential candidates, they are always talking about how the Democratic Party is destroying America. Or how the Democratic Party is out to deconstruct America, this very apocalyptic rhetoric, very violent rhetoric. And at the same time, they glorify guns. I mean, look at how many Republican candidates appear in ads holding assault weapons. It's actually a very high and very alarming number. And so you put it together, Republicans are basically communicating on the one hand, A, our political adversaries are going to destroy this country, and B, we love guns and guns are for self-defense. Get as many guns as possible and use them. You put those messages together and it's basically an incitement to violence, which I'm afraid you're going to have more lunatics who are taking up that cause.
Why do Republicans always seem to be able to present this public message more succinctly, even if erroneously, than the Democrats? And they always seem to get the Democrats on the back foot when it comes to messaging. Max, did you freeze up? Let's see if we can get Max back. I don't know if our tech guy, Jeffrey, can weigh in on this. Can you hear me, Max? I don't see. Let's see whether we can get, there we go. Max, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
Okay, there we go. Freeze frame moment. Did you get to hear my question?
What was the latest question?
The question is why Republicans always seem to have more powerful and succinct messaging than Democrats and get the Democrats on the back foot. Do the Democrats just want to speak in footnotes and Republicans have no wish to do so?
Well, I think part of the explanation is that Democrats are actually focused on passing legislation, and that involves a lot of horse trading and nuance, and it tends to blur the edges of your arguments. For example, President Biden is reluctant to go after tooth and nail after Republicans because he wants Republican votes for major pieces of legislation that he's trying to pass. And he was negotiating with Republicans and he passed the infrastructure bill with some Republican support and so forth and so on. Whereas most Republicans are not interested in passing legislation. They're simply there to get on Fox News, to get on Twitter, to make a name for themselves and to be as obstructionist as possible. And of course, Republicans have a huge advantage because they have at their beck and call this giant messaging machine led by Fox News, which will uncritically repeat whatever the Republican line of the day is. Democrats don't have that. I mean, if you look at what are the sources of information for Democrats, they tend to be organizations like the LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and others that Republicans may think are biased against them, but those organizations present both sides of the argument. They don't just print propaganda, they don't just print lies, and they're often quite critical of Democrats. They often run a lot of criticism of President Biden or other Democrats in a way that Fox News just does not criticize Republicans in that way. So it's kind of an inherent built-in advantage for Republicans.
Before we get to questions from our viewers, I do want to ask about sizing up what a Trump campaign for another presidency would look like. Would he wait till the last minute just to throw the Republican field into chaos, to raise as much money as he possibly can to his own advantage before declaring, and just enjoy seeing the whole party field upset, as happened last time? But who is going to run against Donald Trump in a primary, and what would his campaign look like?
I mean, I don't think he's going to wait until the last minute this time, because he's basically signaling right now that he's going to run because he wants to make sure that he hoovers up every last dime of Republican money that's out there. He doesn't want, Ted Cruz or Ron DeSantis or somebody taking money away from him, right? I mean, this is what this guy is all about is making money. And so he wants to make sure that all the Republican money stays with him. And so, even if he ultimately decides not to run, he has every financial incentive to wait until the last minute to make that decision. But, if he does decide to run, I think, he's going to have a massive head start. And again, I just don't see anybody who's a credible candidate who can stand against him in a Republican primary.
We've seen reports on the fact that it is conceivably possible that in the midterms that the Republicans could choose to make Donald Trump Speaker of the House. And Ellen Pritzker wants to know, is that even plausible, or is it just a rallying point for Republicans and a fear point for Democrats?
Yeah, I don't think that's plausible. I don't think that Kevin McCarthy is voluntarily going to step aside, and Trump does not want to be Speaker of the House. Okay, he barely wants to be president. He just wants to be lionized, but he certainly does not want the work that comes with trying to keep the House Republican caucus together. I don't see that happening.
What is the hold that he has on people? I know this is a question for the ages, and historians will be pondering it 100 years from now, if there's anything left of history 100 years from now. But we have several questions alluding to why it is he has this hold.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's different for different people. I think he has, he's tapped real constituencies for some of his deplorable views, the racism and the nativism. I think he's tapped into something in a huge part of the Republican base, his kind of smash nose politics, the fact that he doesn't mind saying that the media are the enemy of the people, that Democrats are traitors. He's basically like the Republican id come to life. I mean, he basically says stuff that a lot of Archie Bunkers out there think, but they've never actually seen, a credible mainstream candidate say what they think, and Donald Trump does. And so I think that's the source of a lot of his hold over the Republican base. And then, of course, you have all the opportunists among the Republican apparatchiks and politicians, journalists, and others who basically just want to give the base what they want to hear. And so it's almost nobody is willing to stick their neck out to oppose this onslaught.
We have a question from F. Silverman about the funders of the Stop the Steal campaign and the question of dark money as opposed to Trump supporters in the beginning. Are they moving to methodically alter the election mechanism in many swing states, which we've discussed? But this dark money prospect for Stop the Steal and other movements is also alarming.
Yeah, I mean, Stop the Steal is another one of these Orwellian tags, right? Because the people who are trying to steal the election claim that they're only acting to prevent Democrats from stealing the election. It's, you can sort of lose your sanity very quickly if you try to follow the logic of this side. But yeah, there's no question there's a lot of money behind it. And, one of the alarming things to me is that after January 6th, a lot of major Republican donors, including a lot of companies, said, hey, we're not going to donate to Republicans who supported this insurrection. But guess what? They're back to donating. A very few of those donors have actually made good on their threats, because for most of them, upholding our democracy is not actually a priority. They're much more worried about, like, oh, I want tax cuts, or, I want judges, or I want something else. I want support of Israel, whatever they want. Democracy is not their priority. And so they're willing to back an absolute authoritarian because, he aligns with their priorities.
There are a number of questions too about voting rights. People feel frustrated and want to know what they can do as individuals. If you're in California, of course, you have senators who are supporting it. But as you said, it's not going anywhere in the Congress of the United States. Is there anything that people individually can do?
Move to Arizona or West Virginia, I guess, and put pressure on Manchin and Sinema. I mean, I think the one thing that you can do as an individual is keep in mind that even if the voting rights legislation does not pass, Republicans are not going to be able to physically prevent people from voting. They're going to make it much harder to vote. They're going to make it much less likely that minorities in particular will vote. But if people are motivated enough, they can still cast ballots. And so the key is they have to be motivated enough to overcome all of the hurdles that Republicans are putting up and go out and vote. And as you vote, I think, keep in mind the priority of preserving your democracy, which means that there are almost no Republicans you can vote for at this point and have any confidence that they will stand up to Donald Trump's power grab.
The Republicans in some states have gone to absurd lengths. I think it's Georgia that says now you can't even give a bottle of water to someone waiting in line to vote. Could it be a kind of reductio ad absurdum that you're going to get prosecuted for giving a bottle of water to somebody in line and people will begin to realize this is ridiculous?
I mean, it is ridiculous, but I don't think they make any bones about it. I think it's designed to be ridiculous. They're designed to deter Democratic voters from going to the polls, and they're going to make it as difficult as possible. And this is just one example of many of how they're doing it.
Here's a question from Lena in Sherman Oaks. If Biden doesn't run in 24, who would be a strong candidate? Remember that Teddy Roosevelt did himself no favors by saying he wasn't going to run again. And so Biden is leaving this open. We have Kamala Harris as vice president, who contentiously bought a pot or a pan in Paris while she was there.
Right.
Goodness. But
that's almost as bad as inciting an insurrection against
yes, my
Congress,
goodness,
spending
Javier.
like $300 on some cookware.
But the same question may apply to the Democratic field, because you have a Democratic incumbent president. How do the Democrats strategize? How do they even look, or is it going to be up to Biden to signal whether or not he's going to run again before anything can happen? And if so, who would be in the mix?
Well, I think, it's very hard to bet against somebody who is the vice president of the United States. I mean, if the president doesn't run, there's no doubt that ordinarily the vice president is going to be the front runner. And that means, Vice President Harris. And I think that's something that fills a lot of Democrats with a lot of concern, because she was not a very successful candidate on her own in the 2020 primaries. And the reality is she is a woman of color. And so the concern is that she's going to be ripe for this racist, sexist attack that somebody like Donald Trump is going to mount against her. And you would hope that that would blow up in Trump's face. But, I don't have a lot of confidence that that's in fact true, because we've seen that he's been able to transgress all the boundaries of politics and of decency and still win elections. And so, I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of Democrats are fearful, because Joe Biden is not getting any younger. And there's a lot of concern that Kamala Harris is not getting any more electable.
There's a question from Ronald Klemp, which has occupied a lot of people and has been written about before, about parallels between what's happening now and what happened to Germany in the 30s, when Hitler's party, in fact, took over the mechanisms of government. It wasn't so much a coup d'etat as a sense of take over the judiciary, take over the operations of government, get them all in your corner, and then do what you like.
Well, it's not a strategy unique to Germany. And, of course, whenever you get into the Germany analogies, you always have to make the obvious disclaimer, Trump is not Hitler, Hitler was uniquely evil, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no question that the way that Hitler came to power is the way that other dictators, including Putin, including Erdogan, including Mussolini and others, a number of dictators have come to power in democratic systems and then have subverted democracy from within. And that's clearly what Donald Trump was trying to do with his assault on Congress and many other actions over the course of 4 years. And I think what was mainly holding Trump back in his first term was that he was so ignorant and inept. He didn't really know what he was doing. And he was, at least initially, surrounded by the adults in the room, kind of mainstream moderate Republicans who tried to restrain his tendencies. But you saw by the end of his first term, he was basically firing anybody who was going to stand up to him, folks like John Kelly or Jim Mattis or others, and surrounding himself with sycophants and yes men. And unfortunately, if there's another Trump term, which is not unthinkable, that's who he would start off with to begin with. And I think he would be much more experienced in subverting our government than he was the first time around. So I think that's something that we need to be really alarmed about.
Americans tell ourselves that we are not an authoritarian country, that we won't buy into it. And yet what what could possibly stop it, given how the Republicans have positioned themselves in control of so many of the mechanisms of democracy? What could people who say we're not an authoritarian country do if this begins to tilt that way?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, when we say we're not an authoritarian country, I think in some ways that's hubris speaking, because we've been lucky enough to safeguard our democracy for more than 200 years. And there's kind of an assumption, oh, it's lasted this long, it'll last forever. Well, that's not logical. That's not rational. That's not necessarily the case. And I think we've seen the most alarming attack on our democracy in our lifetimes right now. And it's not over, it's proceeding. And what's really terrifying is the degree of indifference on the part of many of our fellow citizens. I mean, most people couldn't care less. I mean, there's a lot of people who are active supporters of this power grab, but then there's also a huge degree of complacency on the part of other people who think, oh, this is never going to happen. This is just alarmism. Don't worry about it. What's the worst that can happen? Let me focus on, my pocketbook issues or something else. And, a lot of us were warning that something like January 6th could happen. I was part of a group that was, wargaming some scenarios last summer, and we were, worried about something exactly like that happening, but it was just very hard to get anybody's attention because it seems so far-fetched. Now we've seen it isn't far-fetched, and we've seen this once. I think we should assume that we could see something even worse in the future. So, I hope that we will not be undone by a failure of imagination here.
Oh, the sky could be falling. Here's a question from Stephen Keenan. Let me cast it this way. Are we looking at a 1992 again, a 1948? Is there a prospect of a sane Republican third party movement to organize to stop Trump or at least pull votes away from him?
I mean, I would certainly be in favor of that if it were to happen, but I think it's just very difficult because, the entire structure of our political system is designed to support two major parties. It's just very, very hard in our system, and we can talk about the intricacies of why that's the case, but we just don't have third parties in the way that you have in other kinds of democratic systems, like in the UK or Germany or Israel or elsewhere. It's really a two-party system. And so I don't have a lot of confidence that you could have a conservative third party that would offer a credible alternative or that would even siphon off enough votes to defeat Trump. I think for moderate, sane, middle-of-the-road Republicans, a category in which I include myself, I'm a former Republican, but I'm still, a middle-of-the-road independent. I think we have to back Democrats at this point. We're just fooling ourselves if we think that there's another option.
Below the radar of party politics in Capitol Hill, there's something else unsettling, which is that health officials and election officials find themselves physically, violently threatened across the country. And so people are reluctant to take on public service positions unless they have a partisan agenda in doing so. Talk about the long-term consequences to us for that.
Well, this is what I'm talking about when I say that there's a real danger of violent insurgency. In fact, it might have already started, because you are seeing an alarming degree of intimidation of people within the Republican Party who dare to stand up to Trump, and who, all the death threats directed against, Republican officials who certified votes for Biden. Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, and many others, they had to have bodyguards to protect them. And a number of Republican members of the House reportedly said that they couldn't vote to impeach Trump because they were scared to do that. They were afraid of what would happen to them and their families. In fact, one of the few Republicans who did vote to impeach, Anthony Gonzalez of Ohio, just announced he's not running for re-election. Part of the reason is because of all the threats that he and his family are receiving. So the Republican Party is in a really scary place right now, because there's a substantial, violent, crazy wing of the Republican Party. And even the people who don't belong to that crazy, violent wing are intimidated by it. They're afraid to stand up to it. So basically, Republicans are hostage to the extremists.
So what should people hang their hopes on?
Well, they should hang their hopes on the fact that most Americans, rejected Donald Trump both times that he ran. I mean, he never came close to winning a popular vote majority. I think most Americans are pretty sensible. I mean, this is, you know, I think most people understand that he is not a competent or desirable president. But again, our political electoral system is designed in such a way that it may not matter because, again, with mechanisms like the Electoral College, with the Senate, the Supreme Court, the minority can rule, and that's I think we're seeing some major defects in the founder's vision being revealed right now, and so it's very frustrating because I think most Americans get it, but the minority that don't have the potential to impose their will on everybody else.
It's alarming. How does the country come back from that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think in some ways, my hope is that maybe if we can survive through 2024, maybe the moment of maximum danger may pass. Maybe at that point, Trump will be too old to run for office again. And maybe there will not be a successor quite as unhinged as he is in the Republican Party. Maybe, so much of presidential politics, I think, ultimately turns on force of personality. And if there is a more moderate Republican out there who has tremendous force of personality, they could actually bring their party along in their direction. Unfortunately, right now, that person has no way of mounting a credible campaign against Trump. But if Trump is removed from the picture, maybe that will happen. I mean, I'm kind of grasping for straws here because I think the situation is pretty dire, and I think we have cause for concern about our future.
Last question. What is the next big event on the horizon that we should be watching? Is it January 6th? Is it something else?
Well, generally, the things you got to worry about are the things you don't anticipate, right? Very few people were anticipating 9/11. Very few people were anticipating January 6th. Very few people were anticipating the COVID pandemic, right? So, I just can't speculate about what's in store, but I'm pretty sure that there are going to be more nasty surprises that will be a stress test of our political system. And if you look at the way our political system has functioned over the last few years, we're not doing real good on those stress tests. I mean, we failed the pandemic, which has become the biggest mass casualty event in US history, in large part just because of information failures, of government failures. There's no reason why so many people had to die. The death rate in countries like Canada is much lower, but we're just kind of a basket case right now. And so I can't predict what the next crisis is going to be, but I think pretty well-grounded concern about how we're going to handle that crisis based on our track record in recent years.
Max Boot's latest book is The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. You can follow him on Twitter at Max Boot. Max, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll see you here again and hear from you again. Appreciate it.
Pleasure to be with you, Pat. I wish I had a more optimistic message to offer, but I think there is cause for concern. But if we're all concerned together, I think we can mobilize and save our democracy.
Maybe that will be the solution. Thank you. Next week, I'm here with Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer Prize winner, the author of the new book, Upheaval and Guns, Germs, and Steel, his seminal book that reassessed how we view and strategize how nations deal with one another and the development of them. So I don't know if we want to get Janice or Zev back again. Either of you want to join us? Nope, I think we're good. So we will see all of you here next week, I hope, for Jared Diamond. And thank you again. Look at the information on your screen and see how you can support these programs. Appreciate your joining us tonight. Thanks very much.